Join us as we learn Chumash for Wednesday, Parshas Terumah, chapter 26, verse 15. Yesterday's Torah reading, we spoke about the curtains and the coverings of the tapestries that would cover the roof of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Today we're going to talk about the actual structure, the walls of the Mishkan. Verse 15. V'asisas hakroshim, and you shall make the planks, the boards, la Mishkan, for the tabernacle, atze shitim oimdim. They should be made out of acacia wood, vertically standing, side by side, as Rashi will explain. Rashi vasisas akroshim, and you should make the planks. Really, you should have said vasisa kroshim. You should make planks. Why does he say es hakroshim, the planks? Like it said by all the other things, it said vasisa shulchan, you should make a table. You should make ark. It doesn't say es. Mao hakroshim. Why then also does he say the? By all the other ones it says you make a table. Over here it says the planks. He's referring to those beams that were already set for it. Yaakov Avinu. Not Harozim b'Mitzrayim. Yaakov Avinu already planted acacia wood, cedar woods in Egypt. Ukeshemeis, and when he died, Siva Lebanov, he told his children, La'aloisam imam keshiyotzim b'Mitzrayim, that they should take it with them when they leave Egypt. V'omer lehem, and he told them, She'osad HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'tzavises and lasim mishkan b'midbar, and he told them that God is going to command you to build a tabernacle in the desert, and that tabernacle you would need mi'atzei shitim from acacia wood. He made sure that this would be ready for them to use. And this is what we find in the piyut, in the liturgy, that there was a fellow that we say that there are some that say on Pesach from a fellow by the name of Reb Shlomo HaBavli, Tos matam zeirazim koidos patenu arazim, that was sprouted the great height, the cedar trees that were prepared beforehand by those who were hastily making it ready for the home to be built, which was Yaakov. That Yaakov was ready and eager to get those cedar woods ready for the acacia wood that would have to be used for the building of the tabernacle. These planks would be standing vertically, that the length of the planks would be standing vertical, and they would stand as the walls of the tabernacle, side by side the other planks. You shouldn't make the beams horizontal, like in the width of the beams, one beam on top of the other, but vertical, side by side, next to each other. An interesting thing that we know that the Rebbe talks about in his famous discourse of Basi Legani, how the tabernacle, which is a divine presence of God in this world, so too each aspect of the tabernacle symbolizes of the absolute bringing the divine presence into this world, and especially how this is seen by the kroshim. The word keresh in Hebrew is made up of three letters, kuf, resh, shin, which those three letters can mean a plank, a keresh, as well as it makes the word a kesher, to connect, and as well as the word sheker, which means a lie. The job of the tabernacle and the task of the tabernacle and the divine presence in this world is to transform the lies in this world to a connection and making it upright, a connection together with God. As well as the word shita, which is the word shitim for acacia wood, comes from the word shtus, nonsense, folly. And the fact that a tree of nonsense means weighing to the wayside, but God tells us to take the shitim and make it oimdim, take the foolishness and stand it upright, meaning that we have the ability to take the foolishness of nonsense and transform it into a foolishness of holiness, as we have the ability to take the lie and transform it into something of a connection with God. The entire job and task of the tabernacle is transforming the physical into spiritual. The Torah now continues with the measurements of each one of these planks. Verse 16. Eser amis erech hakodesh. The length of each plank would be 10 cubits. And the width of each plank would be 1.5 cubits. Rashi, Eser amis erech hakodesh, lamadnu, it teaches us Gavi shal mishkan eser amis, that the height of the mishkan of the tabernacle was 10 amis. Lamadnu, from here we learn Arka shal mishkan, the length of the mishkan. Esrim krashim shayi b'tzafan u'bedarim. There were 20 beams on the north and south side, mizrach l'mayrev, going from east to west. So that gives you shleishim amma, 30 ammas long, because if each one was an amma and a half, was a cubit and a half, you have 20 beams. That makes it 30 cubits long. Verse 17. Shtei yodes lakeresh echad. There were two arms, for each plank there were two tenons, two little arms that would come out of it. Mishulavis isha alachisa, as well as they were parallel to one another. This is what you would do to all the planks of the tabernacle. What does it mean? Shtei yodis lekeresh echad. So Rashi explains how they would do this. For every plank, there were two little pieces that would come out on the bottom. They were like pegs. What they would do is they would cut out from the beam in the middle, in the height of an amma, and they would leave a quarter of an amma on the side and a quarter of the handbreadth on each side. This way, these look like hands. They were like pegs that came down from the center of the beam. There were two little pieces, each side indented by a quarter of an amma. The actual engraving, the cutout, was a half of the beam in the middle. What was the point of those two pegs? The oisna yodis, and those two pegs, the hamachnes ba'adanim, would go into the empty salo sockets. Va'adanim govern amma, and the sockets were an amma high. V'yoshim and they would sit straight. So our boim zaytalza, you had 40 sockets, one next to the other. There were 20 beams. Each beam had 22 pegs. That's 40 pegs for the 40 sockets. The actual width of the cutout was the size of the width of the socket. So you had the empty part of the socket where this peg would go inside. The leftover, the quarter of an amma around it, would cover the top of the socket, so the entire beam was sitting on the socket. Because if not, because if not, then you would have empty space between the two of them, and that's the point of when the Torah says that they should be matching up with one another, that there should be no empty space, and they should fit exactly to the socket that it goes into. Mishulavis, what does the word mishulavis mean? That these pegs, asuyim can mean shlivis, they were made like steps. Sulam, muvdali zubazu, that there were two pegs separate from one another, not that there was one beam that would sit in it. You had two of them separate from one another with a space in between, like a ladder. Mishupin rashayan, and the heads of them were a little pointy. Likanis b'techalal adan, that they should be able to go into properly to this hollowness of the socket. Just like a step of a ladder, the prong of a ladder has these pointy parts that go into the sides of the ladder, so too you have these pegs would fit into the sockets exactly. Verse 18. One more Rashi. Isha lachaisa. Why does he use the terminology Isha lachaisa, like facing each other? Zukenegezu, one mechuvanes, exactly zukenegezu, one to the other. Meaning, that the two pegs that are coming out, the cutout that you have, should be exact. You shouldn't have that you're going to have one peg, that the one beam that the peg is forward, and one beam the peg is backwards. They should all have the exact measurements around it, and that's why he enumerates a quarter space that was underneath that they would cut out. Then they would have the pegs coming out, and then a half a cubit space in between. And this should be exact, so all of them should be evenly made. The Targum shal yodis, the Targum, the Aramaic explanation, explains the word yodis, pegs, tzirin, lefish, tziri adelas, and nichnasim b'cheri amiftan. He calls it hinges, because it looked like the hinges that go into the door to be able to keep the door closed, so it fits in what they would call today tongue and groove type of thing. Verse 18. Vasisas akrashim lamishkan, and then you should make these planks, these boards for the tabernacle. How many are you going to make? Esrim keresh. You will have 20 planks. lif'as negva teimana, for the southern side. Rashi lif'as negev teimana, the word peya, zu loshem miktuya. The word peya over here means side. Every single side was called a peya. Like it says, the ruach ever damer, like the Targum translates to the south side. Verse 19, underneath those planks you will have then 40 silver sockets, bases, that will be made under the 20 planks, two planks, two sockets for every plank, for the two pegs that would be coming out of the plank, and two sockets under each plank, for two of its pegs. Rashi, there's no Rashi on this one, so we continue on to verse 20. And for the second side of the tabernacle, Lifas Tzofin, which will be on the north side, Esrim Kaddish, will do the same thing, have 20 planks. Verse 21, and there you will have as well 40 silver sockets, two sockets under each one of the planks, and two bases under each one of the planks, two silver sockets for each plank. Verse 22, what about for the back of the tabernacle, which that would be the west of the tabernacle? Tasa shisha krashim. Over there you're going to have 6 planks. Each one of those planks, 1.5 cubits, that will be fully exposed into the tabernacle, as Rashi will explain. Well, the Yarkasei HaMishkan means Lashon Seif, the end, or the Seifil, Lefisha Pesach b'Mizrach, being that the entrance of the tabernacle was on the east. Kari Mizrach Panim. So therefore the east is called the face. V'Amaidiv, and the west is called Acharayim, the back. V'Zo Seif Shapanim Ureish. This is the end because the face was the beginning. Tasa Shisha Krashim, you're going to make 6 beams. Harei Teisha Amis Rechav. 6 times 1.5 gives you 9 amos width. Now the Torah continues, Lushnei, so you have now 6 that are visibly seen fully in the actual tabernacle. Ushnei Karashim Tasala Miktsuis, and then you're going to make another 2 which are going to go on the corners. Hamishkan are the corners of the tabernacle. B'yarchasayim in the back. So you have 6 in the previous verse, as we said, 6 which would be visibly seen, then 2 that would go into the corners. Rashi explains, what does this mean? Shnei krashim tasal l'miktuis, 2 beams, added beams, echad l'miktuya, each one for each corner, one for the northwest corner and one for the southwest corner. Echad l'marav is the remes. So therefore you have a total of kol shmeina krashim b'seder echad. You have 8 beams, one after the other, lined up one after the other. Hein. The only difference is that these 2 corner beams you did not see on the inside of the Mishkan completely. You only saw a half a amma of each. So from the inside of the Mishkan you had only 10 ammas. You had 9 ammas for the 6 times 1.5, plus a half a amma and a half a amma of the 2 corner ones. Which would bring it to 10. Because you have the Amma on each side left over was then on the sides of the Mishkan, north and south, so that the corner, so when you look from the outside of the tabernacle, the corner was even, but on the inside it was less the space than it was on the outside. Verse 23. We just did that. And you make the 2 beams in the corner. Verse 24. You will make sure that the 2 planks in the back corner and everything should be flushed. And all the planks should be flushed at the bottom. So too on the top they should all be flushed. They should all be even. You will put a ring that will then connect the 2. The same thing will also be done to the 2 corners. That means, as we mentioned in Rashi previously, that you wanted on the bottom all the beams should be flushed one together, attached to one another. As well on the top it should be flush, and there was a ring that would keep them in place, that would keep the 2 together. Rashi explains this and says as follows. V'yiyu soyamim lamata. Kol hakroshim toyamim. All the planks should be equal, should be flush. Zel azam lamata from the bottom. Shliyafsik evis far shnei adonim b'neim la'achikam zumizu. That the thickness of the socket should not create space between any of them. This is what I explained previously in verse 17, that therefore they have to make the pegs cut out properly, that they should all be even, so they sit in the planks, and all of them sit evenly in the planks. And this is that why you had that empty space around the pegs, that they would sit and cover the socket, so all should be covered and sitting evenly on the edge of the socket. So too the beam that's next to it. So thereby you have everything is sitting evenly and flush to the socket, and there's no empty space between them. The same idea would be when you have then the corner beams. How do you situate those? Those would have to be cut out to its width. That means it's going to have to be cut out towards the width of going to the north or the south, depending on which side it is. Because you have the sockets that are there, and there's one socket going this way, and then there's the other socket going that way, so therefore the sockets are all going in the same direction. So you would have that the beams will then be cut, the corner beam, the pegs would be going the opposite way of the beams that were horizontal on the back of the Mishkan. Now, besides on the bottom of it being flush to the sockets and making sure that even the corner doesn't have any extra space, on the top as well, the Torah wants that there should be flushed. And how did they do that? They had this ring. Every beam on the top had a little indentation that would be at the edge of each beam. That indentation would be the thickness of this ring that would sit on it. And that ring would then sit. You have one beam to the other beam, and the ring that would sit by the both, which would be like this bracket that would hold them both in place. So it makes that it should be flush to the plank that's next to it. Rashi explains, Rashi says, I don't know if those rings were always in the planks or they used to take them out as well, or they would move them around. The beam that was in the corner, the one that was in the corner needed one that was the thickness of the south and the north, and then also the beginning of the one that was on the west. So because it was a corner beam, it needed a special corner bracket that would fit and be aligned to the one that was either the north or south, as well to the one that was on the west. Nichnas l'seicha would go into it and would keep it in place. This way, so if you had the corner beam, on one side of the corner beam, it was connected to the north or south wall, it had that indentation, and on the other side of the corner beam, it had an indentation that would connect the ring with the western wall. So this way your corners were built, and once your corners are built, it gives support to the rest of the columns. Ken yiyeh l'shneim, this is the way you would do it for both of them, for both corners. L'shnei hakroshim shel b'miktzaya, for both corners for both beams that are on the corner. L'keresh b'seif tzafent, for the plank that was at the end of the north wall, v'lkeresh ha'maravi, and for the plank that was on the west wall. V'chein l'shnei miktzayis, that's the way it would go for both corners. Verse 25. V'hayu shmeina kroshim, so the total you would have now 8 beams on your back end wall. V'adneim, and the sockets would be kesef silver socket shishasar adanim, 16 sockets. Shnei adanim tachas hakeres echad, 2 sockets for every beam. Shnei adanim tachas hakeres echad, and 2 sockets for every beam. Rashi v'hayu shmeina kroshim. What does this mean? These 8 beams. So as we mentioned, this is talking about the western wall. This is what we mentioned previously about making the 6 beams with shnei krashim taslam miktzos, and then you have the 2 beams on the corners. So I give you a total of nimtza shnei meina krashim b'seidem aravi, which gives you a total of 8 beams on the western wall. Rashi gives us a bottom line of what all the beams were and how they worked, and he says as follows, and he brings it and quotes it from the Brisa. Kach shenuye b'Mishnah. This is the way it's discussed in the Mishnah. Ma'isa say there are Akroshim, the detail of how the beams were made, B'mlechas HaMishkan, by the details of the construction of the tabernacle. And the Mishnah says the following. They would make the sockets empty, hollow them out, and then they would also carve out in the beams on the bottom. Ravia mikan v'ravia mekan, a quarter of the handbreadth, a quarter cubit here, a quarter cubit on each side. And the indent and the peg was halfway in the middle. And then they would make two pegs that were looking like two legs that were coming out of the beam. Rashi says, what it means is not chamukim, but the word is supposed to be chavokin, which means two steps of the ladder. Like two prongs of a ladder, like Rashi mentioned previously, that are separate one from the other. And they were on an indent. And like this was on a slant, so it would go easily into the hollow socket. It's like a prong that goes into the sides of the hole of the ladder. That's why it uses the terminology mishulaves, which means a shliva, like a prong of a ladder. Then the Brisa continues. Rashi now goes back to the Brisa and says, then they would take that beam and put it into the two sockets, as it says, and then he would scratch, then he would carve out a little indentation on the beam on the top, etzba mikan, a finger off the edge, the etzba mikan, and a finger off the edge of the other side. And they used a golden bracket to be able to connect the two, so that the beams don't separate one from the other. As it says in the verse, that they should be flushed one another on the bottom. This is the text of the Mishnah, and I explained the ideas that are mentioned in this Mishnah according to the passages that we just read. Verse 26. And now you're going to make crossbars. Atzei shita made out of acacia wood, chamisha, 5 of them, for the planks of one side of the tabernacle. That means 5 crossbars for each side of the Mishkan. Brichim, kitargumi, the Targum says, akrin, malaz, ashpadish. These is long poles that they would then connect the beams as well. Chamisha let karshit sela Mishkan, 5 for each side of the Mishkan. Elu chamisha, these 5, shloisha hein. There were really only 3. What does this mean? Elo shabriach elyon vatachten, because you had a crossbar on the top and a crossbar on the bottom. Also, mishtei chatichas were made out of 2 pieces. Zem avriach at chatzia kesel, one would go halfway, and v'zem avriach at chatzia kesel, and the other one would go halfway. They would put them on both sides on these little rings that would come out of the beams. They would put them through half on one side, one half on the other side, until they would meet one the other. But the middle crossbar, that would go inside the beams across the whole length of the wall. It would go from one end of the wall to the other. As we're going to see in the verse, it says that the center crossbar would go from edge to edge. The top and bottom crossbars had rings on the outside that they would sit in, on the beams. Every plank, every beam had 2 rings that the crossbar would go into. And then, they took it by thirds. That means if you take the beam and split it up into thirds, one would be in the first top 2.5 cubits, and the other one was on the bottom 2.5 cubits. And then you would have those rings, and that's where the crossbar would go into. And each part was on a quarter of the crossbeam. So if you split up the crossbeam, you had the quarter top, you had one crossbeam. On the bottom, you had another crossbeam, and then you had the center one that went in the middle. אבל לבריח התיכן אין טבויס, אלא הקרשים נקובים, ונכנס במתיכן הקווים, שהם מכוונים זה מול זה, וזה שנאמר בתיכן הקרשים. The outside ones had rings on each one which were exactly parallel, and every single beam had the exact same 2 rings, so therefore the crossbar was able to fit into them, one on each side to be able to meet. The middle beam, however, was a hole inside the planks that they put a crossbar with inside the beams, inside the planks, and that would go all the way around from edge to edge of the beams, of the planks. You have now the difference between the middle one, that means the inside one, and the outside ones. The outside ones, which were on the north and on the south, was 15 amas each, because remember there were 30 amas long, and he's saying it met halfway, so each one was 15 amas, 4 pieces. And the hatichain, however, the middle one, Arka Shloishim Amba, was 30 amas that went from edge to edge. From one edge to the other. Min ha-mizrach v'ad ha-ma'ariv, from east to west. V'achamisha brichim sheb'ma'ariv, and then there were 5 crossbars on the west wall. Oirech al-yin v'tachtenim sheish amas, they were 6 amas long. Hatichain orka shtei mesrei, and however the center one was long 12 amas. Connect reich of shmena krashes, to be able to take the whole width of the 8 beams that were there. Kachim mefarashes b'malachas ha-mishkan. This is the way it's explained in the brisa pertaining the construction of the Mishkan. Verse 28. And the center crossbar, which was full length, that went inside. They drilled a hole in the middle of the beams on the inside. Went from one end to the other. So you had 5 beams total on each side, 2 beams on top, 2 beams on bottom that met each other, and then the center beam that went inside from edge to edge. The Esa Kroshim, what are you going to do with these planks? They're not just going to stay acacia wood. The tapazov, they should be covered in gold. And the rings that are on the outside should also be made from gold. Botim labrichim, they should be to hold the crossbars. The reason why you're putting the rings on the outside, they're going to be there to hold the crossbars. And these crossbars should be covered in gold as well. Botim labrichim, Rashi says, these rings that you're going to make on the actual planks, botim lekanis b'mabrichim, they're going to be rings to insert the crossbars in them. V'tzipisas abrichim zav, loisha yazav medubak al abrichim, not that the gold was stuck onto the crossbars. She'ein aleim shum tzipui, ela b'keder she'kevei kamin shnei pepiyah shel zav, not that they took the crossbars and then they coated it in gold. What they did was, they were like these 2 empty pieces of gold, 2 hollow pieces of gold, and what they would do is they would in the actual ring there was a piece that there were tubes, and those tubes were covered with gold, and they would fit the beams through those tubes. So it was then covered with gold. So not the actual crossbar itself was wood, but they fed it through these gold empty hollow tubes, and this way it was covered with gold. The koivanitzel tabas l'kan, because they would set it next to the ring. So you had the ring in the middle, and then on both sides of the ring you had these empty tubes that were set there. And the length of them would then fill the whole width of the beam. The crossbar would go in it, and from there into the ring, and from the ring it would go into the second hollow part. So if you would look on the outside of the tabernacle, you wouldn't see wooden poles, you wouldn't crossbars, you would see golden crossbars, because all along the beams you had the hollow tube, a ring, and then another hollow tube. So when you'd fit the crossbar through it, you would fit it through the tube, then the ring, then into the other half of the crossbar. So on the outside, these were protruding on the outside, you saw these crossbars. However, on the inside of the Mishkan, you didn't see any of these hinges or any of these crossbars or brackets. All these brackets and everything was only on the outside of the Mishkan. On the inside of the Mishkan was smooth walls. Verse 30, and then you shall erect the tabernacle, according to its proper order, that I showed you on the mountain. Once everything is complete, then hakimu, you should put it up. Because I'm going to eventually show you what is supposed to be done. So therefore, whatever I'm going to show you how it will be done, that's the way you will eventually do it when it comes time to putting up the tabernacle. This concludes the first this concludes the fourth Torah reading of Parshas Terumah.